August 17th, 1943, 0800 hours. Somewhere over the Reich, 27,000 feet above the patchwork farmlands of central Germany, the air temperature hovers at 40 degrees below zero. Inside the aluminum fuselage of a B-17 Flying Fortress named Memphis Belle. Waist gunner. Staff Sergeant Clarence Winchell watches condensation from his breath freeze instantly into crystalline particles that drift through the unpressurized cabin like snow. Through the open gun port, wind screams past at 200 miles per hour, carrying with it the smell of high-octane aviation fuel, cordite, and something else, something metallic and sharp that men who've been in combat recognize as the scent of fear mixed with adrenaline. 376 bombers fill the sky this morning, arranged in combat boxes designed by mathematicians and tacticians who calculated that overlapping fields of fire from 16 50 caliber machine guns per aircraft would create an impenetrable sphere of lead. The Germans called these formations fliegende Festungen, flying fortresses. They called them this with respect, with caution, and increasingly with a dark irony born from watching these fortresses burn. The B-17 was supposed to change everything. When Boeing's designers first presented the prototype in 1935, they'd created what appeared to be the perfect strategic bomber, an aircraft that could defend itself, that could fly in daylight, that could strike targets with precision and return home without fighter escort. The concept was revolutionary. Pack a bomber with enough defensive armament that it becomes its own fighter screen. 13 50 caliber machine guns in later models with overlapping fields of fire calculated to ensure that any attacking fighter would have to pass through multiple gun positions to reach a vulnerable angle. On paper, in simulations, in the optimistic assessments of pre-war planners, it was brilliant. A formation of B-17s, flying in tight combat boxes, could create a defensive sphere so deadly that enemy fighters would be decimated trying to penetrate it. The 8th Air Force believed this doctrine with religious fervor. They believed it through training cycles, through deployments, through the first tentative missions over occupied Europe. They believed it because they had to, because the entire American strategic bombing campaign depended on this fundamental assumption that heavily armed bombers could survive daylight raids deep into enemy territory without fighter escort. The P-51 Mustang, the long-range escort fighter that would eventually change everything, didn't exist yet in numbers that mattered. The P-47 Thunderbolt had range limitations. The P-38 Lightning was still working through mechanical problems. So the B-17s flew alone, trusting in their armor, their formation discipline, and those 16 guns to bring them home. German fighter pilots initially approached the flying fortresses with exactly the caution American planners hoped for. Luftwaffe pilots had grown accustomed to British bomber tactics, night raids by aircraft with minimal defensive armament, easy kills for experienced fighter pilots. The B-17s represented something different. Intelligence briefings warned German pilots about the heavy armament, about the overlapping fields of fire, about the dangerous nature of attacking these aircraft. Early engagements seemed to confirm these warnings. German fighters that made conventional attacks from the rear or sides found themselves flying through streams of tracer fire, taking hits, losing aircraft. Several Luftwaffe squadrons reported that attacking a B-17 formation was suicidal, that the defensive firepower was too intense for single-engine fighters to overcome. But the Luftwaffe was learning, and what they learned would turn the flying fortress from an impregnable castle into a metal coffin at 27,000 feet. Oberleutnant Egon Mayer of Jagdgeschwader II was the first to systematically document the fortress's fatal flaw. After surviving several engagements with B-17 formations, Mayer spent weeks analyzing American defensive tactics, studying gun positions, calculating angles and blind spots. What he discovered was simple and devastating. The B-17's defensive armament, impressive as it was, had been designed to defend against attacks from the rear quarter and sides. The nose of the aircraft, where the bombardier and navigator sat surrounded by plexiglass and minimal armament, was virtually defenseless. Early B-17 models mounted only a single .30 caliber machine gun in the nose. Even later models, after the vulnerability became apparent, could only fit limited forward armament. The physics of the airframe simply didn't allow for the kind of heavy defensive positions that protected the rest of the aircraft. Mayer developed a tactic called the head-on attack. German fighters would position themselves 5 or 6 miles ahead of the bomber formation, then turn directly toward the lead aircraft and attack in a shallow dive, closing at a combined speed exceeding 500 miles per hour. At this closing rate, the firing window lasted only 2 or 3 seconds. But in those seconds, a skilled pilot with 4 20mm cannons could pour enough explosive rounds into the nose of a B-17 to kill the pilots, destroy the flight controls, or ignite the fuel tanks. And the bomber's defensive guns, designed to track aircraft attacking from behind, were nearly useless against a target approaching from directly ahead. The tactic spread through the Luftwaffe fighter wings like doctrine handed down from the gods of war. By summer of 1943, German fighter pilots had overcome their initial fear of the flying fortress. They'd learned its weakness, and they were exploiting it with methodical efficiency. August 17th, 1943, was the day this knowledge crystallized into Catastrophe. The 8th Air Force launched Mission 84, a dual strike against the Messerschmitt factory in Regensburg and the ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt, targets deep in the Reich, beyond the range of escort fighters, defended by concentrated Luftwaffe forces that now understood exactly how to kill flying fortresses. 376 bombers took off that morning. 60 would never return. The German fighters came in waves, attacking from the front in coordinated passes that American gunners struggled to counter. A B-17 named Ruthless took a 20mm round through the nose that killed the bombardier instantly and wounded the navigator. The pilot, fighting damage controls, managed to hold formation for another 12 minutes before German fighters returned and finished what they'd started. The aircraft disintegrated at 26,000 feet, scattering debris and crew members across 3 miles of German countryside. Ruthless had 16 guns. None of them saved her. Wolfpack lost her entire nose section to a head-on attack by FW-190s. The plexiglass shattered, the bombardier station simply ceased to exist, and the aircraft began a slow, spiraling descent that lasted 4.5 minutes, long enough for 5 crew members to bail out, not long enough for the pilots, trapped by jammed escape hatches, to escape before impact. Jersey Bounce survived the fighter attacks but took damage to 2 engines. She fell behind the formation, losing altitude, becoming what bomber crews called a straggler. German fighters circled stragglers like sharks around wounded prey. Jersey Bounce fought for 23 minutes, her gunners burning through ammunition, shooting down at least 1 confirmed fighter, maybe 2. It wasn't enough. She went down near Eupen, Belgium. 3 survivors, 7 killed. The sound that defined this battle wasn't the 50 caliber guns, wasn't the roar of Wright Cyclone engines, wasn't even the explosion of aircraft breaking apart at altitude. It was the sound of empty brass casings hitting aluminum deck plates, a constant metallic rain as gunners fired, reloaded, fired again, trying to track targets moving too fast, attacking from angles the guns couldn't adequately cover. Thousands upon thousands of cartridge cases accumulating on the floor of bomber fuselages, each one representing a shot that failed to stop what was coming. American gunners fired an estimated 1.5 million rounds of 50 caliber ammunition during the mission. They claimed over 100 German fighters destroyed. Post-war analysis suggested the actual number was closer to 27. The discrepancy wasn't dishonesty, it was chaos. Multiple gunners from different aircraft firing at the same target, each claiming the kill, targets obscured by smoke and distance. The desperate human need to believe that all this firing, all this defensive fury, was accomplishing something. But the losses told a different story. 60 bombers lost meant 600 crew members gone, killed, captured, or missing. That represented 16% of the attacking force, far above the sustainable loss rate of 5% that 8th Air Force planners considered acceptable. Some bomber groups lost over 30% of their aircraft. The 100th Bomb Group, flying out of Thorpe Abbotts, would eventually earn the nickname the Bloody 100th for loss rates that should have been mathematically impossible to sustain. Survivors returning to bases in England that evening climbed out of aircraft so shot up that ground crews wondered how they'd remained airborne. Tail Gunner Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth from the Belle of the Brawl counted 37 holes in his aircraft, including one that had passed within inches of his head. Ball Turret Gunner Sergeant Raymond Hughes from Piccadilly Lilly emerged from his cramped position to discover that a 20mm round had penetrated the turret's armor but failed to detonate. A malfunction that saved his life by margins measurable in milliseconds. The intelligence officers conducting debriefings that night heard the same story repeated by crew after crew. The head-on attacks were devastating. The nose guns were inadequate. The defensive formation that was supposed to provide mutual protection had gaps that German fighters exploited with surgical precision. One pilot, whose name has been lost to history, but whose words survived in mission records, said simply, "They told us we were flying fortresses. They didn't tell us the Germans had figured out where we'd left the door unlocked." The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission became a turning point, though not in the way American planners hoped. It proved that unescorted daylight bombing deep into Germany was unsustainable. That the flying fortresses' defensive armament, impressive as it appeared on paper, couldn't overcome determined attacks by skilled pilots who'd learned the aircraft's vulnerabilities. A second raid on Schweinfurt in October 1943 resulted in even worse losses. 77 bombers shot down, 20.4% of the attacking force. The 8th Air Force temporarily suspended deep penetration missions, tacitly admitting that the fortress concept, at least as originally envisioned, had failed. But the B-17 itself hadn't failed. The aircraft was magnificent, tough, reliable, capable of absorbing damage that would destroy lesser bombers and still bringing crews home. The problem wasn't the fortress. It was the doctrine that asked it to fight battles it couldn't win alone. When long-range P-51 Mustang escorts became available in sufficient numbers by early 1944, everything changed. The B-17s no longer had to rely solely on their defensive armament. Escort fighters intercepted German attackers before they could make their head-on runs, breaking up formations, forcing defensive maneuvers that reduced accuracy. Loss rates dropped dramatically. The combined bomber offensive continued, eventually achieving its strategic objectives. But those bronze cartridge cases, thousands upon thousands of them, continued to accumulate on the floors of bomber fuselages. They became a kind of ritual object, a talisman that air crews believed in even when evidence suggested that belief was misplaced. Gunners would run their hands through piles of spent brass during quiet moments, counting them like prayer beads, calculating kill ratios that were more hope than mathematics. After particularly intense missions, ground crews would shovel out hundreds of pounds of brass from each aircraft, physical evidence of defensive fury that had, more often than not, failed to stop determined attackers. The Germans came to understand something about American doctrine that would prove true across multiple theaters and multiple years of war. Americans believed that firepower could solve problems, that enough guns pointed in enough directions could create safety through volume of fire. Sometimes this was true. Often it wasn't. But the belief itself was unshakable, a cultural conviction so deep that even catastrophic losses couldn't completely dislodge it. A Luftwaffe pilot named Hans-Joachim Marseille, interviewed after the war, said something that captured this dynamic perfectly. The Americans thought they could build a fortress that flew. They didn't understand that a fortress is only strong because it doesn't move. The moment you put it in the sky, it becomes a target with too many places to die. The B-17 continued flying missions until the war's end. It dropped over 600,000 tons of bombs on European targets, more than any other American aircraft. It achieved legendary status, earned the respect of crews who flew in it and enemies who fought against it. But it never became the invincible flying fortress that early doctrine promised. It became instead something more real and more valuable, a weapon that worked when properly supported, that protected its crews better than any contemporary bomber, that could absorb punishment and continue fighting. Not a fortress, a tool, a very good tool wielded by brave men in a doctrine that had to learn its limitations through blood and fire. The last combat mission flown by an 8th Air Force B-17 occurred on April 25, 1945. The crew dropped their bombs, turned for home, and experienced not a single instance of enemy fire. The Luftwaffe, by this point, had been reduced to scattered remnants. German pilots who survived remembered fighting the B-17s with a mixture of respect and dark satisfaction. Respect for the aircraft's toughness, satisfaction at having proven that even the mightiest fortress has vulnerable points. In a bunker somewhere in what remained of the Reich, as Russian artillery pounded Berlin into submission, there may have been a German pilot who still possessed one of those empty 50 caliber cartridge cases, picked up from a crashed B-17, kept as a souvenir, fingered absently during long nights of defeat. If such a case existed, if such a pilot survived, perhaps he understood what that brass cylinder represented. Not American strength, but American faith. Faith that abundance of resources could substitute for perfection of design, that 16 guns could solve problems that required different solutions, that firepower was its own form of invincibility. The Americans did eventually dominate the skies over Europe, but not because they built fortresses that flew. They dominated because they built fighters that could escort those fortresses, because they accepted losses that would have broken other nations, because they had factories that could replace every bomber shot down and train new crews to fly the replacements. The fortress was never invincible. The system that supported it, that fed it with fuel and ammunition and replacement parts and endless waves of young men willing to climb into aluminum tubes and fly into flak and fighters. That system was the real fortress, vast and impersonal and ultimately unstoppable. The brass casings kept falling, kept accumulating, kept making their metallic rain music on aluminum decks. They fell during missions that succeeded and missions that failed, over targets that mattered and targets that didn't, through years of war that ground men and machines into statistical data points. Each case was identical to millions of others, standardized, mass-produced, interchangeable. Each represented a shot fired in defense of a doctrine that promised safety through firepower. And each, in its own small way, proved that abundance without strategy is just noise. That 16 guns mean nothing if they're pointed in the wrong direction, and that even fortresses fall when the enemy learns where to strike.